There is a clay tablet in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford that does not begin where history is supposed to begin. It begins before the flood, not as a metaphor, but before the flood. It begins in a time the document treats as continuous with everything that comes after, with the same administrative formulas, the same record-keeping logic, and the same belief that what is being preserved is worth preserving. The tablet is a list of kings. The first king ruled for 28,800 years. The second ruled for 36,000. The list gives these numbers without apology, without explanation, and without any sign that the scribes who copied them thought they were strange. It does not explain the numbers. It does not place them inside any larger cosmological framework the reader can see. It simply records them in the same calm administrative style used to record grain rations and temple inventories, as if impossibility were a category the document had no reason to use. I found the Sumerian King List the way you find most things that matter, while looking for something else. I was tracing the scribal formulas used to record dynastic changes in early Mesopotamian administrative texts, trying to understand why certain set phrases stay unchanged across 1,000 years of political upheaval, and the King List kept appearing as the earliest and clearest example of the pattern. The deeper I went, the more I realized the formulas were not the real problem. The numbers were, and the numbers led somewhere that the standard account of ancient history cannot easily explain. The Sumerian King List survives in more than a dozen cuneiform fragments and copies. The most complete of them is the Weld-Blundell Prism, a four-sided clay column excavated at Lhasa and now kept at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The prism dates to about 1800 BCE. But the tradition it records is older, much older. Thorkild Jacobsen, whose 1939 critical edition is still the main scholarly study of the text, identified linguistic and structural features suggesting the list draws on sources older than the Ur-3 period, with oral or administrative roots that may go back even further. The scribes who wrote the Weld-Blundell Prism were not composing. They were copying. And what they copied begins not with the first king of a known dynasty, but with a cosmological statement that has never been fully explained. It says that before any human institution existed, kingship itself came down from somewhere above. That phrase is not decorative. In Mesopotamian administrative culture, the right of a ruler to rule came from divine appointment. A king ruled because the gods had given him that right, and that right could be moved, taken away, or given to another city. The King List turns this theology into a historical record. But the opening formula carries real weight. The document is telling you that what follows is not just the history of rulers, it is the history of a cosmic institution temporarily housed in human cities. And the first city that institution chose was Eridu. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition. Archaeological work at Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, carried out most fully in the 1940s under Fuad Safar and later added to in the decades after, revealed occupation layers reaching back to about 5,400 BCE, among the earliest urban settlements yet found in Mesopotamia. In Sumerian cosmological thought, Eridu was not simply the first city to be built. It was the first city to exist. It was the place where the god Enki established the Absu, the underground freshwater ocean, understood as the source of wisdom, magic, and the Mi, the divine laws that governed civilization itself. Craftsmanship, priesthood, the scribal arts, all of these belonged to Enki, and Eridu was where he kept them. The King List gives Eridu two kings. Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Al-Algar ruled for 36,000. Together, they make up 64,800 years of pre-flood history at one site. The usual scholarly answer is that these numbers are mythological or astronomical in origin, multiples of the Sumerian sexagesimal base, the base 60 that also lies behind the 360-degree circle and the 60-minute hour. That explanation makes sense. It is also incomplete. Random mythological exaggeration gives you rough round numbers. These figures are not rough. They are exact multiples of a specific mathematical unit, arranged with the same inner order you would expect from a calendrical or astronomical calculation. What the reign lengths mean is unclear. That they were deliberately constructed is not. After Eridu, kingship moves. This is the structural feature of the pre-flood section that gets the least attention and deserves the most. Kingship does not spread outward from Eridu to cover many cities at the same time. It moves cleanly and completely to a new place. The second city is Bad-tibira, with 3 kings whose reign lengths are 36,000, 43,200, and 28,800 years. The longest reign in the whole pre-flood record belongs here. Enmenlu-Ana at 43,200 years, exactly 8 multiples of 5,400, a number with known importance in Sumerian astronomical reckoning. Bad-tibira means roughly the fortified place of the copper workers. It was the city of Dumuzi, the shepherd god linked with fertility, the dying season, and the ritual lament that echoes through Mesopotamian literature for 2,000 years. The movement of kingship from the city of wisdom and underground water to the city of metal and craft is not random. Each pre-flood city held a special place in the Sumerian understanding of what civilization needed. The order in which kingship moved through them traces something that looks less like political history and more like a structured index, each city holding a different kind of knowledge that made the world work. The third city is Larak, with 1 king, En-Sippar-Zid-Ana, ruling for 28,800 years. Larak is the least documented of the 5 pre-flood cities. Its location has not been firmly confirmed. No major excavation has identified its site. It appears in only a small number of other Sumerian texts and leaves almost no separate trace in the surviving record. This near absence is not proof against its existence. It is a clue about what was lost between the pre-flood world and the world that copied its memory onto clay. The King List records Larak without apology and moves on. Sippar is different. Sippar, modern. Tel Abu Haba, widely excavated in the 19th century, was one of the most important religious centers in ancient Mesopotamia, the city of Shamash, the sun god, the divine judge whose domain included law, truth, and the written word. That connection matters. Sippar was understood as the place where divine writing was kept, where the laws of the cosmos had been written down before the flood, and where they would need to be recovered after it. In the flood narrative tradition, it is at Sippar that the antediluvian wisdom texts are said to have been buried before the waters came, so they could be dug up and restored after the world began again. The King List gives Sippar 1 king, Enmendur-Ana, ruling for 21,000 years. He is the shortest ruling of all the pre-flood kings and possibly the most symbolically important. Other texts identify him as the figure to whom the gods taught the reading of omens, the interpretation of oil on water, the first keeper of divination. His city is the archive of the pre-flood world, and it is the last stop before everything ends. The 5th city is Shuruppak. Kingship arrives there last before the flood, carried by 1 king, Ubaratutu, who ruled for 18,600 years, the shortest reign in the pre-flood sequence, as if time itself were shrinking toward a limit. The name Shuruppak appears across Mesopotamian literature in a way no other pre-flood city does. It is not just a place on a list, it is a place with a story that survived the water, and that story is older than any of the tablets that preserved it. Shuruppak means, in the most accepted interpretation, the healing place, or the place of refuge. The meaning is not decorative. In the Sumerian flood narrative, known from the Eridu Genesis, preserved on a broken tablet in the University Museum in Philadelphia, and first translated by Thorkild Jacobsen and Samuel Noah Kramer, it is at Shuruppak that Ziusudra, the Sumerian flood hero, receives his warning. The gods have decided to send the flood. One god, speaking through a wall or a reed hut, in the oldest version of a story that will be retold for 3,000 years, tells Ziusudra what is coming and commands him to build a vessel. The city of refuge becomes the last city before the end of everything, and the King List confirms it. Shuruppak is where kingship rested when the flood arrived. Then the line comes, the flood swept over. That is almost the whole text of the break. No description of the water, no length of time, no account of what was destroyed or who survived except for the single figure already known in the flood tradition. The administrative record notes the event and continues. What follows is a new section heading. After the flood had swept over, kingship again descended from heaven, and then a new city, Kish, and a new line of kings. The document treats the destruction of the entire pre-flood world as a short note between two administrative periods. This is either the greatest compression in ancient literature or the behavior of a document whose readers already knew exactly what those three words meant and needed no explanation. The grammar matters here. Mesopotamian scribes used set phrases to mark different kinds of change: the transfer of kingship from city to city, the defeat of one dynasty by another, divine action in human affairs. Each kind of shift has its own formula. The flood gets one too. Swept over, the verb active and complete, a bounded event with a beginning and an end. Not a mythic chaos without edges, but a historical event in the administrative record, treated with the same language used for a military defeat or a dynastic transfer. The scribes who copied this line were not writing poetry. They were making a notation. Think about what the King List does not say. It does not say the pre-flood cities were destroyed. It records that kingship moved among them during the pre-flood period, that the flood swept over, and that kingship descended from heaven again at a new place. The cities themselves, Eridu, Bad-tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, are not said to be gone. They are simply no longer the seat of the cosmic institution, and several of them went on as settlements in the historical period. Eridu is attested through the 3rd millennium. Sippar was a major city for 2,000 years after the flood date the text suggests. Shuruppak, modern Fara, excavated by a German team in 1902 and an American team in the 1930s, shows occupation layers from the early 4th millennium through the early 2nd millennium BCE, with a strong early dynastic layer lying directly above a layer of water-laid sediment about 1 meter thick, dated to about 2900 BCE. That sediment layer is not unique to Shuruppak. Leonard Woolley found a similar deposit at Ur, and similar layers have been found at Kish and at Uruk. The debate over whether any of these matches the literary flood is unresolved and probably cannot be settled with current methods. What is not disputed is that the sediment is there, at the site the tradition names as the last city before the end, lying beneath the administrative records of the civilization that came after. Here is where the seven-city question becomes impossible to ignore. The main Sumerian King List tradition gives 5 cities before the flood, but the tradition is not the same everywhere. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 278 BCE, produced a history of Babylon, the Babyloniaca, using temple archives that no longer survive. His version names 10 antediluvian kings, not 8, and gives their cities differently, with some names matching the Sumerian tradition and some that do not. The total number of cities in his account is disputed because the text survives only in fragments quoted by later writers. But the structure is the same: multiple cities, impossible reign lengths, a flood, a survivor, and a beginning again. The tradition is wider than any one tablet, and if Berossus was using sources independent of the Weld-Blundell scribal line, which the differences in his king names strongly suggest, then the 5-city count of the cuneiform tradition may be a partial survival of something larger, not an invention of 7 cities, but a damaged record of a fuller sacred geography that the surviving tablets no longer keep whole. The number 5 is what the tablets give us. The number 7, and the wider traditions that point toward it, mark the edge of what the tablets preserved and ask what was lost beyond that edge. A title that promises 7 cities is not inventing a tradition. It is pointing to the place where the tradition breaks and asking what stood on the far side of the damage. The parallel that makes this hard to dismiss as coincidence is structural, not numerical. The Genesis genealogies list 10 antediluvian patriarchs, Adam through Noah, with lifespans starting at 930 years and then dropping slowly toward normal human length across the generations after the flood. The Sumerian King List shows the same decompression pattern across a different numerical range. 2 separate literary traditions, in 2 different languages, using 2 different mathematical systems, are encoding the same structural movement. A world before the flood where time followed different rules, and a world after it where time slowly returned to the scale of a human life. The pattern is too consistent to be chance and too deeply built into the structure to be simple borrowing. Both traditions are preserving the same underlying shape. Neither one invented it. After the flood, kingship descends from heaven again. The formula is exactly the same as the one that opened the pre-flood section. Not similar, not adapted, not updated for a new age, but identical. The scribes who composed this document treated the pre-flood and post-flood periods as one continuous history separated by an event, the way a chronicle might treat a dynasty interrupted by conquest and then restored. The flood is not the line between myth and history in this document. It is a turning point inside a single, unbroken administrative tradition, and the tradition continues on the other side without changing its language or its assumptions. The first post-flood city is Kish. The King List gives Kish 23 kings in its first dynasty, beginning with Jushur, who ruled 1,200 years. The number is still impossible by any biological measure, but it is not 43,200. The compression has already started, and it begins the moment the flood line is crossed. By the third king of Kish, the reigns are in the hundreds of years. By the 10th, they are nearing a range that seems merely legendary instead of cosmological. The decompression is not perfectly even. There are irregularities throughout, but the direction of movement is steady, and it continues across the whole post-flood sequence toward an eventual meeting with human scale. Gilgamesh appears about a third of the way through the post-flood section, the fifth king of the first dynasty of Uruk. The king list gives him 126 years. He is the first king in the whole document whose reign falls within the range of a very long human life. And he is also the first for whom separate literary evidence exists on a massive scale. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved across many recensions, spanning 1,000 years of uneven tradition, most fully on 12 tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, describes a king who seeks immortality after the death of his companion Enkidu, and finally finds Utnapishtim, the Babylonian flood survivor, the one human granted eternal life as the single exception to the mortality the gods imposed on the world after the flood. Utnapishtim lives at the mouth of the rivers, beyond the waters of death. His city before the flood was Shuruppak. He tells Gilgamesh this directly. The last pre-flood city is the flood survivor's permanent address in the literary record, 2,000 years after the events the tradition claims to describe. Now map the decompression completely. The 8 pre-flood kings across 5 cities account for a combined reign of about 241,200 years in the Weld-Blundell version. The first post-flood dynasty at Kish already shows combined reigns reduced by an order of magnitude across its earliest kings. By the time the list reaches dynasties that overlap with independently confirmed historical records, the Akkadian Empire, under Sargon of Akkad, whose dates scholars place around 2334 to 2279 BCE, the reign lengths have fallen into the range of decades. The shift from pre-flood cosmological time to historical human time is encoded in the mathematics of the document itself. The scribes did not attach post-flood history to a mythological introduction. They built a numerical bridge between two kinds of time, and the bridge is calibrated. Calibration does not come out of storytelling, it comes out of systems. Think about what calibration requires. Someone had to decide that the pre-flood total would be written in multiples of 3,600. Someone had to decide that the decompression would move downward across dynasties instead of resetting at random. Someone had to keep that structure intact across centuries of copying, across political changes that destroyed every dynasty the list was meant to legitimize, and across the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian as the main administrative language of Mesopotamia. The king list was not simply preserved. It was maintained, actively and deliberately, at every point in the chain by scribes who understood they were handling something that could not be rebuilt if it were lost. The Berossus parallel tightens the problem until the coincidence explanation stops working. Berossus, drawing on Babylonian temple archives around 278 BCE, archives independent of the Weld-Blundell scribal line, as the differences in king names show, gives a pre-flood king list whose reigns total 432,000 years. That number is exactly 10 times 43,200, the longest single reign in the Sumerian list, the reign of Enmenlu-Ana at Bad-tibira, 8 multiples of 5,400. 2 separate lines of transmission divided by centuries, written in different languages for different audiences, use the same base unit as the mathematical foundation of the pre-flood world. The Sumerian list spreads 241,200 years across 8 kings. Berossus totals 432,000 years across 10. The totals are different. The unit is shared. That is not 2 cultures independently making similar myths. That is 2 cultures separately preserving the same underlying mathematical structure through different scribal lines. The Genesis genealogies add a 3rd line of transmission, again separate, again structurally parallel. 10 antediluvian figures, lifespans beginning near 1,000 years and shrinking across post-flood generations toward the human range. The same decompression, the same breakpoint, the same structural belief that the world before the flood ran by different temporal rules, and that those rules faded gradually rather than instantly once the flood had passed. 3 traditions, 3 languages, 3 numerical systems, 1 structure. The pattern, stated simply, is this: a pre-flood world measured in calibrated mathematical units, ruled from specific named cities, ended by a recorded catastrophe, followed by a post-flood world that kept the institutions but lost the temporal scale, and that remembered across thousands of years of transmission that something basic had changed at the boundary. The scribes who wrote the Weld-Blundell Prism around 1800 BCE were not inventing that structure. They were preserving it. Every generation that copied the document after them was preserving it. The question they left unanswered, the question the document itself refuses to settle, is what the structure originally described and whether the 5 cities it names were real in a way that places them outside everything the official timeline of ancient history has room to hold. Think about who copied this document. The scribes who wrote the Weld-Blundell Prism around 1800 BCE were trained professionals working inside a tradition that treated accurate copying as both a technical duty and a religious one. They did not compose the King List. They copied it from earlier sources, which had themselves been copied from earlier sources, in a chain reaching back at least to the Ur-3 period, and perhaps farther than the surviving tablets let us follow. These were not storytellers reshaping a tradition for a new audience. They were administrators preserving a record that someone at every stage in the chain had decided could not be allowed to vanish. The duty to copy is not a small detail. It is the most important fact about the document's survival. The Sumerian King List exists in more than a dozen distinct cuneiform copies from several sites: Nippur, Larsa, Kish, Susa, among others, covering a period from about 2000 BCE to at least the late 2nd millennium. It was copied across 500 years of political upheaval, dynastic collapse, and cultural change so severe that the language in which it was first written, Sumerian, stopped being spoken as a living language sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE. Empires rose and fell between the earliest copies and the latest. The religious landscape of Mesopotamia changed greatly, and at every point someone decided the King List was worth copying again, not because it was still useful as a political document, because by the time of the Weld-Blundell Prism none of the dynasties it supported were still ruling, but because it preserved something that scribal culture, across centuries and across the death of the language it was written in, treated as too important to lose. The scribes understood they were working with material older than the readable history of their own civilization. The pre-flood section would have given them reign lengths so far beyond any institutional memory that they could not have checked even one number against an outside source. They copied the numbers anyway. They preserved the city names. They kept the cosmological formula, kingship, descended from heaven, in both the pre-flood and post-flood sections, using the same words for what came before the end of the world and what came after it. They either believed the document was true, or they believed it was sacred, or they could not tell the difference between those two things. In the scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia, that difference may not have been available to them. Shuruppak carries the pre-flood world forward, not as a ruin, but as a living point of reference. In the flood traditions, it is not simply where the last pre-flood king ruled, it is where the gods gave their warning, where the survivor received his instructions, where the decision to end one world and preserve one human line was carried out in a reed hut beside the Euphrates. The city is not destroyed in the story. It is the point of departure. Ziusudra leaves it. Utnapishtim, in the Babylonian version, names himself to Gilgamesh by it. 2,000 years after the events the tradition claims to describe, the name of the last pre-flood city is still the flood survivor's address. The flood ended his world. It did not erase his location from the memory of those who came after him. The archaeological record at Tel Fara, the site identified with ancient Shuruppak, matches this unusually large cultural importance in a way worth saying clearly. The site shows occupation from the early 4th millennium BCE. The early dynastic layer, dated to about 2600 to 2900 BCE, yielded cuneiform administrative tablets, some of the earliest writing found at any Mesopotamian site, a city already producing written records near the beginning of the written record itself. Directly beneath the early dynastic level, the German excavations of 1902 found a layer of water-deposited sediment about 1 meter thick, containing none of the artifacts normally left behind except by a flood strong enough to interrupt settlement for a long period. The dating of this layer points to about 2900 BCE within the archaeological horizon that shows disruption at several Mesopotamian sites at more or less the same time. No archaeologist has said this layer proves that the literary flood happened. The evidence does not support that claim, and careful scholarship does not make it. But the sediment is real, it can be dated, it is consistent with a major flood event, and it lies beneath the one pre-flood city in the King List whose link to the flood tradition is the clearest, the most lasting, and the most deeply built into every branch of Mesopotamian literature that dealt with the subject. That is not proof. It is the kind of convergence that keeps a question open when everything else would let it close. The question the King List leaves open is not whether floods happened in ancient Mesopotamia. They did, again and again, and with destructive force, and no serious researcher argues that flood traditions across the ancient world came out of pure invention. The question the document leaves open is what the pre-flood section was originally describing. If the 5 cities were mythological creations put together by later scribes to give Mesopotamian civilization a cosmic origin story, then the mathematical structure of the reign lengths has no good explanation. Mythological exaggeration does not produce calibrated sexagesimal multiples kept consistent across separate lines of transmission in 3 different cultures. If the cities were real administrative centers whose histories the scribes were honestly trying to preserve, then the reign lengths represent a way of encoding time that does not fit any historical framework we now have, but that was treated as factual by every generation that decided the document was worth copying. The Weld-Blundell Prism is in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The 5 pre-flood cities lie beneath the alluvial sediment of southern Iraq, some excavated to different depths, none fully understood. The cuneiform archives from Shuruppak are spread across collections in Berlin, Philadelphia, and Istanbul. The flood sediment layer is recorded in excavation reports filed in 1902. Everything is available. The document has been translated, the mathematics have been studied, the sites have been dug, and the question the scribes did not answer, perhaps because they no longer knew the answer, perhaps because they understood it so fully that explanation seemed unnecessary, still remains in the record they left behind. Was the King List a mythological origin story built from theological tradition and astronomical symbolism to give Mesopotamian civilization a cosmic ancestry it had not actually earned? Or was it the last readable copy of an administrative record from a world that ended before writing was supposed to exist? A world whose cities were real, whose rulers governed across spans of time no current framework can explain, and whose memory the scribes preserved across 5 centuries of copying because they understood, even if they could no longer fully explain why, that this particular record was not theirs to lose. The tablet is in a museum. The cities are under the ground. The sediment is still there beneath the oldest writing we have found, and the question is still open. The same question in the same silence that the Weld-Blundell scribes left behind when they lifted their stylus and filed the prism away.